companies. Jon is currently freelancing with companies across Southeast Asia to build their user experience capacity and lead complex user experience projects. He provides coaching and performance expert usability reviews. Jon was previously a vice president of product at Jakarta-based startup incubator Arden Labs and started Busy Commerce Indonesia. He was also a director of user experience of Australian-based user experience agency Technocrat, and he has been a president of Toronto design and development agency Visca for over a decade. So we're really happy to have Jon here with us. He will shortly connect with us, and he'll begin his presentation. Okay, guys, just to be clear, we'll be recording the presentation so all of you guys can review it and share it with your friends and learn and rewatch it and so on. Jon, can you hear us?
Yes, hello. Thanks for the introduction. And I appreciate everyone coming and joining me to learn a little bit more about UX. So the reason that I put this presentation together is because I had a lot of startups coming to me and asking about UX, what it was, how it in particular, they were curious about it in light of the challenges that they face as startup founders. They have a really unique set of challenges. And I can imagine many people that are on this webinar or listening to it know those issues. Their budget constraints and people issues in terms of finding the right talent and just general accessibility to knowledge. There's the time factor where you're trying to get something to market quickly, and the last thing you want to do is add more time to that process to get something out the door. So there's a lot of challenges there, and I wanted to put a presentation together that spoke to a lot of that. So it's a realistic approach to UX. So what I'll do is I'll run through basically what UX is, give you some examples, and show you the general process of it at a high level, and then go into how we can get that incorporated into your startup in a way that makes sense, that it's a practical way of doing it. So what I'll start with is just a collection of examples of what UX is and how does it help product design. This is the plug that was in my hotel room when I was in Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam. And actually I was there giving somewhat of a similar presentation in Ho Chi Minh to startups there. That plug is kind of where I plugged everything. It was my iron, it was my phone charger, it was my computer, it was everything. What do you think happened each time I plugged something in to that plug? My lights would go out. Every single time, and it didn't matter how I plugged it in or what I plugged in, it would always turn the lamp off. And when you did a closer examination of the plug, you very obviously realized why. Because they tried to cram 3 things into a single phone housing, a single plug housing. So you can see in the picture that the plug exceeds the width of the socket and protrudes onto the switch for the lamp. It was incredibly annoying. The experience of that product for me was not good. And I can imagine for the thousands or millions of others that had to contend with the same plug, they too were dissatisfied with that product's design. So say, for example, a company came to a UX expert and said, hey, we're really having abysmal sales of this product, and we'd love to know whether it really suits the people we're trying to sell it to. what would a UX professional do to try and fix this problem? You can see right now that the plug is divided into 3 zones, one handling a phone, the other handling electricity, another a switch. What would we do to possibly revise that into a more improved user experience? Well, I would personally take that plug, bring it into an environment where I'd invite people in that met the type of audience that would use this plug, which in this case would be anybody really. If it applies to someone that is going into a hotel room, you're not talking about a very specific niche, and get them to plug things into it and experiment and use different variations and observe and record what the findings are. Have the plugs so that, like at the hotel room, it's sitting above a cabinet. Have it sitting so that it's just above the floorboards on the floor. Have it so that people are plugging things in and out in dark and lit conditions with different devices. Get them to bring their own devices, their own kettle, their own iron, their own computer power adapter, so that you can see the variety of devices that will be interacting with this product. And once you've actually done all those observations and you trend the findings, I think you'll find that perhaps maybe you'd come up with something like this. Now, obviously, I haven't gone out and done that research, but if I could make an assumption, I would say that, maybe there was more space afforded for plug so that it would not protrude into other sections of the device, that the light switch also, so that it had larger space for affordance of being able to turn on and off in low lit conditions. And the phone plug would sit middle to the bottom because the phone plug usually stand onto the floor and then back up to where the phone is actually sitting. This, to me, resolves a lot of those issues and would likely be the outcome of a lot of usability testing. But it's interesting because UX goes a little step further, and it's always looking to justify design decisions. So you might actually find out through feedback of the users, they may say to you, you know what, this product is much better, but I haven't used a phone line in 5 years. And you may start to trend that and realize that your product is not actually keeping up with the expectations of the consumers. What they may tell you, however, is that they're tired of those bulky bars that have surge protection in them. And that's the eureka moment. As a UX team, you realize it's actually a surge protector that they're looking for. So not necessarily just design, it's also about the strategy and the feature set of a product. This is another example. This is an ATM machine that I was sitting in front of in Shanghai, China. And when I attempted to do a transaction, the error message that I got was, transaction is canceled for some reasons. Now, that's not the most elaborate explanation of what was wrong. In trying again, thinking maybe it was a temporary problem, I actually realized, no, I'm not going to get past this, and I'm going to have to start looking for other options. That's not a great user experience. Contrast to an ATM machine that I had a similar problem with, located in Melbourne, Australia. This ATM machine said it's out of service, but it also told me, here's a contact number that you can call to get help on this problem. And in proximity to this ATM, here are all the other ATMs available to service you, and a map with an actual pin for all those locations so that you can just walk down the street, turn left, and there's another ATM waiting to help you. Now you tell me which one is a better user experience. Well, I don't have to look for hands up in an audience to know that the second one is obviously what you want. That ATM machine is a good example of how a UX team had sat and thought through the process of, if an error occurs, what would the user want that machine do to help guide them through getting that problem resolved? Here's another interesting one. This is more of a digital one. I was flying frequently back and forth between Melbourne and Sydney for work. And every time that I went to check in online with Virgin Australia, I was presented with this screen. Now, the biggest problem with this screen was always the fact that to move forward, yes was red and green was no. And no matter how many times I did this web check-in process, it always got me stuck. And this goes back to that same experiment that you may have tried, where they have, say, for example, the text that says the word green, but it's printed in blue, and it always confuses the mind. UX would have worked this process out. It would have created more clarity in those buttons so that the user knows how to proceed forward in a process, rather than leaving them confused each and every time they use it. It would also attempt to lessen the number of clicks or the number of scrolls to achieve critical processes, which in this case, for example, I have to ask myself as a UX person, why do we need to scroll through a list of large icons which could easily have been fit onto a single page? But this is the one that really bothered me every time I went to check in. Because my trips were typically 1 to 2 days, I didn't need to check baggage in at the checkout. Secondly, my seats were always already assigned. If you look at the screen in front of you right now, you'll see that the design had not afforded me an option based on my particular situation. It will only allow me to check in baggage or to select a seat, which I've both already done. I've basically slipped through the cracks of this journey as an edge case, which shouldn't be the case because there would be thousands and thousands of business people like me doing the exact same thing. This is where user experience would have come in and weeded all of this out before I would have ever encountered this type of a problem. You can see that the status at the top does not represent what my options are at the bottom. I have no clear path to my goal. What it also helps to do is to help arrange information in a way that's easy to digest for a user. If I was to top up my Wi-Fi hotspot's credit on this telco's website, it isn't optimal as a user to read through and easily select a product based on my needs. The reason for that is because we have columns that are unlabeled and relatively duplicates of each other. We have many select buttons all compounded into a tight area. And we have click more information links that lead to essentially content that's almost the size of the link itself. UX would have thought through all of the things that need to happen on this page and would design it in a way that doesn't necessitate clicking to learn more about something that's very small. And it would have arranged the content so that the duplications of the variables in those two columns wouldn't be necessary. So if I had to sum up what UX is, for me, I always feel it's about people designing with people for people. This is very much a people-driven career, and it's a very people-driven thing that you incorporate into your business. Everyone in your business becomes part of UX. It's not just a single person or a single team. It impacts how the whole business thinks. You may ask, and I have this asked of me a lot, is what's the difference between UX and a visual designer or a UI person? And for the purpose of this, I'll just lump visual design and UI into the same category, is that think of UX as the architect of a building, say for example an office tower, and they put together the blueprints of the floor plans, of the rooms, of the elevators, of all the utilities that go into making that building functional. Maybe there's even a car park and how the people press through from the car park into the main building and vice versa. Whereas the visual designer is more responsible for things like the wall colors, the carpet selection, the landscaping in front of the building. All of these sort of aesthetic layers that give it that visual appeal is the responsibility of the visual designer. I think that's the best analogy that I can come up with to try and explain the differences between the two. Look at that difference in a process perspective. What the visual designer, the original sort of visual designer process that maybe many of you have gone through in the past, is that the visual designer will essentially make a mock-up of all the pages sort of in a static form. And these are given to whoever the stakeholders may be, which may be the project manager or the owner of the company if it's very small. And it'll go through this refinement cycle of moving things around until they look like they're functional and satisfy the design appeal that they're looking for. And it goes sent over to engineering and they turn it into a working product. The difference with UX is that right from the beginning, there is a strong emphasis on research and understanding the users and understanding why this product is being built and understanding what is the brand language of this product and this company and how is that going to apply to the design of the site or of the digital product. So what you have is deep user insights, a brand language, which is often in the form of a style guide, and really in-depth market research and strategy and scope around what this product will be and how it fits into the marketplace. That all fuels what is then put into design. And I'll go through this process in a bit detail later on. That design is then validated not with the stakeholders only, but also with users, the people that you anticipate will use this product. You put it in front of them because you want to test your assumptions. You want to test your research to make sure that, in fact, it's going to be appropriate for the marketplace. And during this process, you've already started engaging engineering, but there's a point where you start handing over, okay, this is the blueprints of what we need to put together. If we look at it at a different perspective again, as we sort of get drilled down into the detail of the UX process, we start off with strategy and scope. And that's really to define what is this product? What are we building exactly? And who's it for? And what pains are we solving this? It's an interesting thing because when you start going through this set of questioning, you realize how many gaps you have in terms of knowledge of your own product. You may, at a high level or even at an intimate level of certain parts of the product, know it very well. But I think when you go through a proper process of digging really deep and trying to weed out all of the aspects of the product, you realize there's quite a bit missing. So the strategy part of this is an amazing way to really cement the foundation of what will be designed. And the scope really helps to narrow down what is the feature set that is most appropriate to get launched into this product based on what the users need and what the business needs. Because UX is very much a marriage between the commercial interests of this product, whether you're trying to sell something or sign someone up to something or whatever its business objectives are, with the user objectives. What does the user want out of this product? Why are they using it? Why does it exist for them? Those two things are the inputs to the UX process where it's actually being designed. And you'll see here in the screen that it's a sort of a hub and spoke type configuration. Depending on who you talk to, they may have put this on a more linear path. But when I think about it, and I think in a practical sense of all of the projects that I've worked on, any of these things are kind of always running throughout the UX process, the design process. You're always thinking about interaction design. You're always working on the information architecture of, say for example, the categories of an e-commerce site. That doesn't just happen over a period of time and then stop. You're always tinkering with it. And the research doesn't just happen at the beginning. You're constantly digging for new information. You're doing competitive analysis through that whole process. That all then, from that process, becomes an output. And those outputs are things like a detailed prototype with specifications and annotations and all these things that help to inform the people that will develop it how to build this thing with accuracy, like you're handing architectural designs and floor plans to someone that will build a building. A style guide that in detail has all of the patterns and all of the colors and typography and branding and all of these things that visual design will need to put the product together. And then finally, a content guide, because at the end of the day, what drives your site is content. And if there's no proper form around what that content is and how it's structured and the governance of how that content will be maintained, then it doesn't really matter how pretty it is or how it's structured if the content's a mess. But all of those things get fueled into product. Now, there could be other things depending on the project that we're talking about, but I want to make sure that this is simplified for the purpose of a startup. Let's dig even deeper about the UX process. So that discovery and scope and all of that research and workshopping that you do up front is again to really nut down for whom this is for, where are they going to use it, when are they going to use it, who are they? So it really starts to narrow down the definition of those people that will use it. And that's best expressed in developing personas. And personas are essentially, say for example, if your target audience, the addressable market of your startup is 1 million people, if you're designing a product for 1 million people, it's very difficult to say, should we do this design decision? Let's think about it. What would those 1 million people say? The response that comes back in your mind is, it's too difficult to grasp. However, if in those 1 million people, you've been able to identify that there's 3 core groups, or 2 or 4, that are archetypes of the general types of people that will use it. Say, for example, you have an e-commerce site, and through your research, you're able to determine that there's usually stay-at-home moms that will use the website. There are students that use the website as well, maybe for different reasons, but they still will use it. And the way that you're selling on that website is suitable for both of their needs. And there may be a professional male that's sort of in their 30s that is also targeted by a specific group of products that you're selling. Those could all be individual personas. And the persona actually puts a face to that particular segment of people, adding things like a particular age, a name, a photograph, their likes and dislikes, their personality traits, the things that motivate them, the things that they dislike. All of these things create a picture so that moving forward, you always have something to use as a guiding light for making design decisions. So for example, one of your personas names Bob. every time you make a design decision about things that impact what Bob would do on that website, you would ask, does this design decision make sense for what Bob will be doing on that website? So it's that, but it's also taking those personas and looking at all the market research out there, doing a competitive analysis, and putting your business requirements together so that you fully understand how this thing is going to monetize. Because at the end of the day, if this thing isn't going to make money, then there's no point. You have to have those business requirements and those business objectives set up front, because that very much shapes how UX will design the site. All of that information is then fueled into designing a prototype and a visual design. But in order to do that, you need to understand how users are going to flow through your website to accomplish specific goals. So if you have an e-commerce site, some journeys, user journeys that are going to occur likely are they're going to browse for a product, they're going to add it to their cart, they're going to go through the checkout process and purchase the product. For the information architecture, you need to put together site maps, you need to put together process flows so that everybody on your team can visually look at how these pages interconnect with one another and how functional things impact other parts of the system. Say, for example, you're designing a system for a warehouse, and all of the workers are doing picking and packing, they're receiving deliveries, and they're shipping deliveries. If you're doing the information architecture on that, you'll want process flows to show who's doing what and how does that impact the system. What is the system's response to that? Where does it store this information? All of these variables need to be defined up front before you can start putting wireframes and things together that visually depict how the interface will work with such a system. But this is really when you start, once you start formulating all of this, you're then at a point where you can start building out the layouts and the designs of the site. And that's where you get into doing sketching and prototyping and interactive prototyping so that you're actually emulating the end product without actually building it. And that's been a huge benefit for companies that would have traditionally had to code up and build and set up databases for applications to work in order to do testing with. With this, with UX, you can easily acquire tools that let you build something that emulates it very rapidly. And within a matter of hours in some cases, or days in other cases, depending on the complexity of the product you're building, you can put something together that actually feels and looks like the end product. So all of this then fuels the next step, which is validating what you've designed. So that would be in the form of doing things like usability testing, taking that prototype and putting it in front of users and observing how they actually interact with it. And doing that over the appropriate amount of people, the sample set, will help you to trend whether specific things are in fact causing usability problems. And it's amazing the wealth of information that you get back from these testing sessions. And when you've recorded it, and the software that records it captures things like their facial expressions through the webcam, their mouse cursor movements, their screen capture, audio. When you go through those videos again and again, it's amazing how much you glean from that. And when you've done 6 or 8 or 10, depending on what's appropriate for your particular study, you'll be able to see that, say, for example, 5 out of 7 users had troubles on page 2 of the checkout process. And you're able to identify that it's placement of a button or something as simple as just a mislabeling of a button. It could be that simple. It doesn't take much to stop someone in a checkout process. They either become confused or they become distrustful of the website because they feel that it wasn't designed in a way that speaks to them. You're then doing other things like you're sending out surveys, you're doing all these things to get as much input as possible before that last moment when you're sending this to engineering to actually start getting it produced. But the important thing is that when you're dealing with engineering as a UX team, for example, you want to engage them from day one. This is very important. It's not something where UX does all the design and then lobs it over the fence and then lets engineering just go at it. It's very much a cooperative effort over the course of the entire project and the life cycle of the product, to be honest. So from day one, when UX is making design decisions, they can't do that in isolation. They need to be able to talk with engineering and discuss what these design ideas are and what the technical feasibility is. You know, with the technology that we have these days, pretty much anything's possible if you're willing to spend the time, and whether you have the budget, and whether you have that particular technology license to you, and so forth. All of these hindrances start coming into play, but anything is possible. And that consultation with engineering really helps to know what the limits are and also what the capabilities are. And it may be beyond what the UX person thought was possible. So there always needs to be that dialogue. But at the end of the day, there does need to be bundles that are sent out. If you're working in sort of an agile format, there's constantly bundles going out, or if you're in a more traditional waterfall format, sort of larger bundle packages that are going to go to engineering for developing. And really, it needs to be presented in a way that really gives them a feeling like they're on the same team. You're going to prepare it in a way that all of the wireframes and prototypes are incredibly detailed so that they are not guessing, say, for example, how a form will handle validation. All of the codes for colors on the site, for example, should all be spelled out in hex codes for them so that they're not using color pickers. There's many things that you can do to make their life easier and to take the guesswork out of it. And the main reason for that is you want them to build a product that most faithfully renders what you guys have envisioned and produced as a UX team and spent all that time crafting. I won't go into this in much detail because there's a lot of information about it on the web, but you know, if you're going to work in an agile type format, you'll want to insert basically design sprints that precede the engineering sprint and gives you time to work through UX issues, and the timing or the number of days or weeks that that's performed is very much dependent on the specifics of that environment. So I can't necessarily say it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 1 week. These are things that you have to research as a business to make that determination. But I think the important thing that I could say, particularly as a startup, is that you're very much in a formulation period, particularly if you haven't launched your product yet. So while many people will say to jump into Agile right away and just iterate and work through each of the sprints while you're coming up with your business, I'd say make sure take the time to start formulating all of this so that you have that concrete foundation up front before you start jumping into sprints. Now, everyone may have a different opinion on that, but I think it gives you an opportunity to really deeply understand your product before you jump into a sprint model. So let me try and sell you on UX and what the advantages are. Because I think it helps to gather and understand business requirements. You know, many of you maybe have worked in companies before where that whole process of trying to understand what this product is actually not an easy process. A lot of people are sort of running around trying to understand it, and it feels like you're kind of on the seat of your pants, like it's kind of slightly out of control. And I think what UX does is help to put process and structure around that. It helps you to look at all the pieces as a whole. Really, UX gives you a holistic view of the product that you're building, because it's very easy to get stuck on small details. And how is that checkout button going to work? Or, how do I add the quantity of adding, a product to the shopping cart, or things like that. But often, if you're just thinking of this in a visual design capacity, you're not thinking of the ripple effect of how that possibly changes the rest of the experience throughout the system. So it's being able to have a bird's eye view of how this entire ecosystem will work and how all of the touch points in that ecosystem will interact with the customer at any given time. And it really drives an understanding of your users, how they think, what motivates them, and what's their behaviors. There are so many examples I could give you, which when we actually got out onto the field and we did field research and really sat beside the users that were going to use our products, many of our assumptions changed. They weren't what we expected. And really importantly is that it creates a hub for decision making. It really has this amazing way of bringing people together in a business. Everybody, and it's not just design and marketing, the usual suspects. Often everybody becomes involved. And I think that's a good thing. It brings departments together that weren't necessarily as close as they were before this. So I can say that's a huge advantage, because design thinking really does have to go through a whole business. You may say to me, well, John, how does design thinking help accounting? But if you think of accounting, it's very much a touch point. Anything to do with money, there's invoices, there's overdue statements. Do they not qualify to have design process put against them? I'd want, if I have an invoice coming to me from a company, that it looks and feels like the rest of the branded products from that company. It takes the guesswork out of design and architecture matters. So again, if you have solid research that can give you clear direction on what to do in terms of features and how things are architected, you're not guessing, you're not just winging it. And I think that is very much a part of why you would incorporate UX, particularly in a startup, because you may think you know your audience until you actually get in front of them and realize there's many differences. Like I said before, it allows you to create products before actually building them, so that you can test with them and validate those concepts. And it gives users and it gives developers detailed specifications so that they're not guessing on how to build the product. So everyone can benefit from this. It doesn't matter if you're still working on the product, or whether it's just been launched, or whether it's matured and it's been out in the marketplace for a while. At any one of those stages in the life cycle of the product, there is great advantage to start using UX, even partially or wholly in your business. If you're just starting now is the time to get those processes in place. If you've already launched into the market, now's the time to start looking at all the qualitative and quantitative data that's coming in from your analytics or your customer feedback, or all these different tools that let you measure the success of your business, and start looking at how UX can help those blockages that they're identifying. If your product is matured, there's always opportunity to increase conversion optimization on that product. There's no point where any business is going to say that won't benefit them. There's something interesting. It's basically called a UX maturity model, and really it's a scale to determine how much a business has embraced UX. And when I talk to a lot of businesses, they kind of typically sit in this region, mostly at 2 and 3. I think every business now has started to become somewhat familiar with UX, and they don't say no to it, but they also haven't done anything about it. A lot of them sit at level 3. They have put some level of investment into it. They've hired a UX person, maybe a junior or a middleweight UX person, and they've thought that they've solved the problem that way. But really, they should be looking at how to bring it into their whole business and make it woven into the fabric of the business. And as a startup, you have this amazing opportunity to do that now, right at the beginning. You know, when you're in a startup and it takes off and you suddenly have 50 people, 70 people, 100 people working, it's very hard to change process and how people think at that stage. But if you're sitting there with 5 people right now, toiling away building that product, this is the ideal time to do it, without a doubt. Another great thing about UX is that it encourages a number of really good attributes that start to be adopted by your business and by the people that work in it. Originally, when I did this particular slide, it was talking about what are the good attributes of a UX practitioner, someone that really lives and breathes the true essence of UX. And I started to list all these things down, but I realized that these all come from the UX process, and therefore businesses could, in fact, start being these things. You know, it's interesting, if I had to highlight any of them, the 4 that I've highlighted are of particular interest. And it was interesting because I had listened to an interview with Microsoft's current CEO on a news broadcast the other day. And the interviewer asked him, when Microsoft's bringing in new employees into the company, what are the 2 things that you look for the most in those new employees? And without skipping a beat, he said, I want employees that bring clarity and energy into the business. And I thought, oh my God, that's what UX is essentially. UX job is to bring clarity into the business. And it's also about bringing energy around design thinking. It's something that shouldn't be sitting in a cubicle somewhere. It should be a group exercise that everybody's involved in. And so I think those 2 things are very important, but it's also about empathy. And I think you'll hear in many UX publications the value of empathy and putting yourself in the user's perspective. I get asked, well, what do you mean by empathy? Well, say for example, I'm doing field research to understand how users in a warehouse will interact with my system to handle all of the, you know, the packing of boxes or pulling things and getting ready to ship them. The empathy comes from me wanting the employee to benefit and the company to benefit from that product working efficiently and productively, so that they can do their job properly, and that each day when they go to work, they're not frowning at the thought of having to use an awful system, and that they become a productive person and the overall SLA of that business, for example, increases. You know, empathy is something that has a lot of definitions around it, but it's really saying that you have a keen interest in the happiness of that end person that's using your product. So what are the tools that you use when you're doing UX process in your business? These are the ones that I've been using, and I'll run through them quickly. Diagramming is really important in those initial stages. When you're creating the flows and the journeys and many other things that you need to document and illustrate in a visual perspective, I've always used sort of OmniGraffle or Visio because these tools are purpose-built. When you're trying to build complicated flow diagrams of complex systems, so even e-commerce can be quite complex depending on what you sell, you don't want to be trying to do that in something that's not purpose-built. Moving into doing the wireframing and the prototypes, there are many products on the market, and they all have varying levels of capabilities, either in how detailed they do the actual wireframes, or how they do the interactions and how powerful that functionality of the software is, I've typically used Axure because it is a very well recognized tool that's used by many of Fortune 100 companies, and it has quite a detailed level of being able to build interactions and being able to do things like variable carrying between pages and validating and all of these things that make it feel like a real product. Some of the tools which are at low cost or free are more about the visual wireframing rather than being able to do complicated interactions, and that's really the difference. For visual design, again, I think it's depending on the visual designer that's involved. They may have their tool of choice. They may want to use Adobe Photoshop or whatever tool that they have on hand. For the past few projects, I've found that Sketch was very low cost and very rapid way of getting visual designs out the door. And it really felt like it speaks to modern designers' needs to create something that is rapidly able to get out the door. Now, you're probably wondering why Snagit is on here. I think what you'll find at the beginning of UX process when you're doing the research is that there's an absolute ton of screen captures that you're going to take when you're doing competitive analysis, when you're taking snippets of research that you've been digging into online. There are so many opportunities where you don't want necessarily the limiting factor being whatever screen capture tool comes with your operating system. You want something more than that. And then finally, when you're doing usability testing, I've always used Silverback, or at least for the past many projects. It's free and it does everything that you need it to. In terms of team collaboration, there's tons of options out there. So these are just suggestions, but Trello was an easy way of being able to just drop ideas into stacks that allow you to categorize things. And Slack was a great way of just being able to communicate text messages and sending things back and forth between participants in a group. Jira was typically used to do the agile project management. Zeppelin was a great way to take all of the output from a sketch project, all the visual assets, and help them translate into things that engineering can more readily use with it and sort of take a lot of the legwork out of their job. I think it was a real help. And there's other versions like Avocado that really help in translating visual design to things that are easy for engineering to use. And of course, there's things like Dropbox or whatever your favorite cloud storage is. And what I've typically done with my teams is create something that I call a virtual design studio. And what that is a shared Dropbox with all the team members of all these things that are inspirational. Firstly, things like ebooks, articles about design, snippets from all around the web that help the design team be at their top of their game in terms of UX. I also make sure that I include things like font libraries and clip arts and royalty-free stock, all these things that make it so that's a go-to resource to help them get their job done. And then when you are doing ideation and you're doing workshops, I'd really advise that if you have the space, is to create a dedicated space for creative thinking. This space is not just for the UX team to just sit there and come up with ideas. This is a hub for the whole business to go in there and participate and co-create. So the great thing about it is it's kind of like the kitchen of the house. You know, when you have people over for a house party, everybody kind of gravitates towards the kitchen for some reason. It's just that place where everybody feels comfortable and casual. And that's very much what a design studio is for, is that it's about creative thinking and allowing people to go and take that journey with the UX team. Now what I'd like to do is go through quickly the unbelievable wealth of UX resources that are out there right now that you can tap to learn about UX. Firstly is to reach out to people like myself that are more than happy to mentor and answer questions. If it's really a good UX person, they're dying to do that. Join groups. With a few minutes of your time, you can be on umpteen groups on LinkedIn and Facebook that are all about UX, and you're suddenly connected with all these people that live and breathe UX that can help you get started. There's websites out there. Obviously, you can go back and check these slides for all the URLs, but there's an unlimited supply of UX-specific websites. But also, as I noted at the bottom, the great thing is that there's also just general publishing platforms like Pulse and Medium, which has anybody able to contribute to it. And I think that's good because it adds variety to perspective on UX, not just what a particular editor of a particular publication thinks is qualified to be on their website. So I think it's a good thing to have that diversity. Like I said before, the social channels, there are so many groups and things that you can connect into. Mostly all of you will have Twitter. It takes moments to start following some of the Twitter accounts for UX professionals, UX groups, all of these things. You can be connected in minutes. There's lots of videos on Vimeo, on YouTube. A lot of the conferences actually drop their keynote and presenter videos into these websites that you can look at. Join some of the associations like the UXPA. They send out regular publications to teach you about keeping on top of the latest UX findings, how to handle things, how UX works. It really is an amazing resource. Now, after all of this, there's lots of free stuff out there. There's many websites that you can learn, but I think there's nothing that beats having a small library of really well-written books. These are just a few that I've sort of, these are ones that, many people would say are kind of like, the biggies of UX and design from what my research puts together. But I think something that might be applicable to this particular audience is a book by Leah Booley, which is the user experience team of one, because often a lot of startups will be exactly that. There'll be a founder or the design person within that business needing to figure out what UX is and how to apply it to their business. And it's a really well-written book because it's just simple, easy to learn, and it's written in just a plain language format that is really quite appealing. Get involved in events. There's events happening all around the world. There's a list of some of them, but likely in the city that you're in, there will at least be a small meetup.com type group that you can go and actually just talk with people and share ideas. There's now a ton of really great resources online. You can go to somewhere like Udemy and for less than $50 have many, many hours of video instructional information on what UX is and sort of the basic principles of it, so that you can get more details about each step of UX than what's in this presentation. And there's some, for example, like Coursera, where it's actual university material that you can actually watch for free, which I think is just an amazing opportunity. And the list goes on. And I think there's this webinar that you're on right now, but there are many others that I get invited to just because I've signed up for newsletters every week. And each of those have an incredible wealth of information that you can take advantage of. The final step is to actually go and do an immersive course or do a part-time course. And places like General Assembly, which is starting to have campuses around the world, is a great way to sort of get hands-on exposure in front of an instructor to learn about UX. If I was to tell you what the elements of UX that I think would bring the greatest returns for you that you could start implementing right now into your startup, I'd say it would be really focusing on getting that foundation up front and understanding what the strategy and the scope is. I think also doing those personas and doing the user journeys is incredibly important because you need to understand your product. And next is, if a user can't find the product that they're looking for on a website, for example, then you're in a lot of trouble. If you're in an e-commerce site and everybody is struggling to find what they're looking for, you only get 1 or 2 chances at that and you never get them back. So it's worth architecting your website and its functionality right off the bat. And finally, I'd really make sure that you get this product in front of users. Make sure that each time you're doing major changes, or even just, in middle level changes, is that you sample test it against the number of users that's appropriate for the change. So how would you adopt UX into your company? I think first is to actually get caught up on the basics and understand what it is. If you're a founder, I think it's important that before you get everybody on board with design thinking in your business, is that you yourself can lead that charge with knowledge. Because I think it's difficult to sell a concept like this to others when you yourself don't necessarily understand it. So it's worth that first bullet being there, which is to know the basics. And that may be a number of combination of the learning things that I just talked about, or maybe getting someone in for a number of days to help weed through all of these, the complexities of incorporated into your design process. Very beneficial. You'd want to understand who is going to do what and how the ideas are going to flow through your business. This is important that it's done up front, because if it's not defined then it has an awful way of morphing as you're going through and trying to make those decisions as you're actually in your design process. And this is making sure that you're maintaining control of that process. Projects that I've been in the past where control wasn't necessarily properly instigated, it caused terrible problems with who had the authority to make what decisions and what channels would design ideas flow to and be approved by. It caused a lot of problems. So it's really worth defining that up front. So really, then you want to make sure that you're measuring and you're validating and you're testing and you're refining and you're doing this over and over again. Unfortunately, some people believe that when they've gone through the UX process and they've launched the product, they sort of ease back on UX. And it sort of takes a back seat because they've launched and they felt that it's done its job. But really, that's just the beginning. It's helped to bring a good quality product to the market, but that by no means that it's a perfect product, and that as your product matures, so does the marketplace and its demands, and your competitive landscape is constantly changing, and the technologies are changing. UX will always be an integral part to your business moving forward. So I'm going to leave you guys with this final statement, which is to make sure that you don't assume about your customers, but to know your customers. This will make an infinitely better product for your business. So thank you very much, guys.
Thank you very much, John, for your presentation.
Thank you.
It was very helpful and very informative. I forget the questions our participants have asked you and send it over to you on Skype. Can you see them? Hi everyone, guys. Just a small technical difficulty. John's app has crashed, but he'll be back with us soon, and he'll answer all these questions you've asked him throughout his presentation. So stick with us for a couple of more minutes, and John will help you out. Hey guys, just to be sure, our Startup Istanbul application is still open. So if you have a great entrepreneurial idea and you want to attend our Startup Istanbul conference, which will aggregate mentors and investors from all over the world, you should apply. We still accept applications. Our investment team will happily look at your ideas. Yes, yes, the John is disconnected for a moment, but he'll be back with us uh, in no time.
Steve, I'd like to start with a fairly classical question. We've been teaching MBAs for over 100 years. We think we teach them management, finance, marketing, operations, strategy, but it seems to me that there's something missing in the classical MBA program. What is missing in a typical MBA program for somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur?
You know, how many of you have MBAs? Everything you learned, if you got your degree in the last, earlier than 3 years ago, is obsolete. Congratulations. And at least for entrepreneurship, not if you want to run a large company. I want to remind those of you who don't have an MBA what it actually stands for. MBA is the Master of Business Administration. Big idea, administration.